probably the best tablet.
Hey, hello everyone. Welcome to day 2 of the QA Southwest Conference. My name is Whelpley, and I'll be talking to you about moving from quality control to quality assurance in your organization. I guess I'll start out by saying that all of you have the rare opportunity of hearing me speak for the very first time at a function like this. So the delivery will be awkward. We'll make mistakes. And I'll probably miss things, so bear with me. The other thing that I will say, though, is I definitely don't have 2 hours worth of material, so you won't have to sit and listen to me talk for 2 hours. Okay. Let's jump right in. Okay, before we start, I'll tell you a little bit about me. I am QA Director at House Interactive. We are a global software company, basically in the contact center solutions space. A lot of our growth has been through acquisitions. I actually joined the company through an acquisition 8 years ago, and since then, since I joined the company, we've probably acquired 8 to 10 other companies and products along the way. At this point, I am responsible for software quality for approximately 10 different products and development teams, and we are spread across the U.S. and Europe. We do have Scrum teams that are based both in Phoenix and in the UK. Some developers will be maybe in Chicago, some in Croatia. So our development teams, our Scrum teams, are distributed across the 2 continents. I've been with House for about 12 years, a little over. I've been in the IT industry for 20 years, and over that time I've worn a number of different hats. I started out as a systems engineer. I did own my own business for a while. We were a system integrator. We were building wide area networks for financial firms across the U.S. When I came to House, I started as a technical manager. I started managing deployments. Then I moved over to customer support. About 6 years ago, I moved into the dev side of the house and started managing the sustaining group, and eventually started managing QA. I've known Bob Small for about 6 years. I can no longer call him a friend because he worked for me about 6 years ago and he quit, and so he's no longer a friend of mine. Actually, it's funny because I was listening to Derek's speech yesterday, and he was talking about healthy debate and things. When Bob and I worked together, healthy debate didn't begin to describe the conversations that we had. He was a really good guy. I was very sorry to see him go, but I'm glad to see that he's doing what he's doing and having a good time. Today, what I would like to do is just have a general discussion about QA and QA teams. And one of the reasons that I want to have this discussion is because I think one of the reasons that I was asked to speak to you is that what we're doing in QA and in product development is a lot different from what a lot of companies are doing. And as I get into it, you'll see why. I think that there are a lot of companies moving in this direction, but they haven't gotten there. It's somewhat of a difficult thing to do, and so I'd like to explore exactly what the impressions of quality assurance is and what QA teams should be doing. After that, I'm going to talk about our approach to quality assurance, things that, where we were, what we were doing, what we decided to do differently, how we got there, and how it's working out for us. Then afterward, if you have any questions, that's great. So, just a show of hands, how many people here are in QA groups, whether you're testers, whether you're managers, or so the majority of you. type of thing that your teams are doing? Are you doing things like creating test plans? Are you building the test environments? Are you testing the software? Are you reporting bugs? Are you automating tests? Is there anything else that you guys are doing?
What's your process?
Process?
Requirements.
You're doing requirements? How involved in requirements are you getting? Are you actually creating the requirements?
Yeah, we'll create the bullet points that lead to these 50 requirements must have test plans.
Okay.
We'll start to we call them level 1, 2s, and 3s requirements. When you go and you say, hey, project is going to cost $100,000, going to be 9 months. Level A type requirements. We typically dive in to get the B and C type requirements to expand those before we even do the test plans. Is what we do.
Okay. At what point do you think you're brought into the requirements process? Right at the beginning?
So the project gets approved at that A level.
Right.
We probably weren't involved at all in that. And software development team and a business function will get there. So then we get involved. So now you define the core development team and the core business folks. Then we get in to do that B and C, level 2 and level 3 type. That's where we get involved.
Are you doing agile, or are you doing?
We do agile. We do we call it fast waterfall. It's basically what our agile is at our. I mean, we use all the right words, Scrum and things like that. But it's focused fast waterfall is what I call it.
Okay.
Because we got the right people, the right phases, the right amount of deliverables. We could do that in waterfall too. But typically, we make waterfall so much more bigger than. So that's our agile at our company.
Okay. Anybody else doing anything? Yes.
We're encouraged to go out to customer discussion sites, see what they're asking for. So
Okay. So.
the product owner also shares his prioritized list of future news stories with us. Seeks not only QA's input, but every other department's input and prioritization. And we're involved in the grooming of these items, fleshing out of what they need and acceptance criteria.
Yeah. So by a show of hands, how many QA people here are involved in creating acceptance criteria on that level? Good. All right. So these are so you guys have pointed out that the two things that I would say, were missing from our group when I started managing the QA group for in-house. So I want to take a look back because I want to give you kind of a starting place of where we started as far as going from quality control to quality assurance. I'm going to take you back to the time that I started in quality assurance. So back in October of 2008. We had a round of layoffs with the company, and one of the people that got laid off was the guy that was handling quality assurance. At the time, I was managing the sustaining group for product development, and I was suddenly told that without a raise in pay or anything else, I will be managing quality assurance also. At the time, there were about 3 to 4 different products that we were developing at the time. There were about 6 test engineers and 15 to 20 developers. So we had a 3 to 4% ratio of developer to QA to test engineer. Of course, I knew very little about QA. I had hung out with the QA guys. I had talked to them quite a bit, but I had not at that time managed a QA group before. And at the time, I was also informed by my management that that they wanted things to change in QA. Primarily what they wanted to do was they wanted some semblance of process in R&D, and they wanted quality assurance. At the time, I thought we had processes. At the time, I thought we had some good quality assurance. Most of the people in dev would probably tell you that we have good processes and we have good quality assurance. So I started looking into what I needed to do, what changes needed to be done. First thing I started doing was I started looking into exactly what quality assurance meant. Started searching the web, looking for some definitions. Went to Wikipedia. If I look at Wikipedia, it says it's a means of monitoring software engineering processes and methods used to ensure quality. NASA, plan, systematic approach, evaluation, blah, 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 all about processes and what processes you're going to follow. QAI Global Institute. Is anybody a CSQA or CSTE certified in here? Okay, so you're probably familiar with this. They talk about activities that modify the development process to prevent the introduction of flaws. They implement management quality policies and so on. The thing that I noticed was that I couldn't find one definition of quality assurance that even included the word test. Yet testing was exactly the thing that our quality assurance people were doing. So that was number one. Number two, I started looking at quality control. Okay? If I look at quality control, it emphasizes testing, right? I look at the same definitions. What Wikipedia describes it as emphasizing testing of products. NASA, the function of quality that checks the products. Okay? And of course, QAI also talks about testing activities that are inspecting and checking the product. Okay. Translation. QA group prevents defects through process and policy standards. Okay, that's what management was trying to tell me, is that they want QA to do less testing. The QC group, the quality control group, finds defects through tests, reviews, and inspections. So it's the responsibility of the quality control group to do the testing and the inspections and things. The problem is that we didn't have a quality control team, and the business was not going to invest in a quality control team. So they wanted QA group to do less testing, yet they needed someone to test. So at that point, I started trying to map out a plan and map out our journey from quality control to quality assurance. First thing I looked at is where were we? Exactly what were we doing? What were our processes? What was QA doing? What was dev doing? And in a nutshell, basically, if you look at the requirements piece, typically what would happen is that the product management group would hand something like a PRD or an MRD to dev management. Dev management would go and consult with some of their peers and maybe some of the senior developers, and they would put together a list of requirements, and they would start mapping out and designing the project and working on the beginnings of the project. Basically, the groups were following a waterfall methodology. So just like most waterfall projects, they had a planning phase and then a designing phase. Then you had your coding phase, testing phase, and then release. Okay. As typical, the software developers were doing most of the design and development. Software developers were doing fairly little testing. QA was doing almost all of the testing, and for the most part, all of it. And system level testing. At that time, 2 of the 6 test engineers were also automation engineers, so they were automating some of the system tests. However, they were fairly poorly documented, and they were about the only ones who knew exactly what testing was being done. From a testing standpoint, the documentation of testing was very poor. I remember at one time asking one of the test engineers at the time, can I see one of your test plans? And that person proceeded to hand me a piece, said, yeah, sure, proceeded to hand me a piece of paper. And it said test plan at the top of it. And I leafed through it, and it had a bunch of sections on it, but there was absolutely nothing on there in the way of a test. And I said, I thought you were I need an active test plan. She goes, oh, that is an active test plan. And that's our template, that's what we use. And I said, well, don't you have any active test plans? And she said, well, no, we keep it all in our heads. We don't use the template anymore, but if you want to see what we could do, we could use this test plan. So documentation was definitely a problem. Processes varied depending on who you spoke to. I'm trying to remember, I think there were 3 to 4 different dev teams running at the time, and though they were loosely following the same types of processes, I think if you spoke to anybody from a different group, you get a different way of doing things, and in many cases, when you spoke to people within the same group, their view of the process was also different. So how is that working out for us? Well, we would deliver the software, and a lot of times we were told those weren't the features that we wanted. Part of the problem that we had was that it was very difficult to predict when we would release something. So if we said we're going to release something in 6 months, and that took a year, by the time we released the features that were stated in that project, everybody wanted something different. So releases were unpredictable. One of the reasons that they were was development cycles typically took longer than we expected. On top of that, QA cycles also ran longer than we expected. And to sum it all up, within the business, there was a very poor perception of product development. Okay, we had a reputation of never delivering on time and not delivering what people wanted. And this was primarily what management was telling me, and I'm sure the management was telling the product developers that the development management, that this is what we needed to change. We needed to change the perception. So, the first thing I needed to do was convince people that we had a problem, just like an alcoholic. First step to recovering is admitting that you have a problem. This wasn't something that I could just go to the business and say, you're doing it wrong and we need to fix this. I needed to get them to actually dig into it and understand where the problems were. So the way that we approached this was we put together an initiative to update the documentation for R&D. At the time, I looked for the current documentation within R&D, and I was unable to find anything, so I was starting from scratch. First thing I did was I called a series of meetings with dev management and with key players within development, and we talked about process. During the course of that time, it really highlighted that nobody was actually following a common process. Now, I say up here that nobody was actually following process. People were following process, it's just that the process was not common. And so what those discussions did was it opened up the conversation to let's talk about change and talk about ways that we can make this better. But until we had analyzed what people were doing and came to the conclusion that nobody had a real understanding of what our common process was, we couldn't start talking about changing the process. that we chose to do was move to a Scrum methodology. At the time, there were teams that were experimenting, I would say experimenting with Scrum, okay? At the time, I think one of the dev managers actually had gone to training and become both a certified Scrum Master and a certified product owner. And so he was running his team loosely in a Scrum process. One of the reasons that we liked the Scrum process was that we liked the iterative piece of it. We liked the thought of the team having autonomy over what they're doing. And we also liked the idea of stories as requirements. It seemed to simplify things. So as we were discussing what we were going to do with Scrum and what we were going to do, here's the things that we kind of focused on. We focused on roles and responsibilities, and not just that, okay, a Scrum Master is going to facilitate the Scrum process, and that a product owner is going to groom backlogs and those types of discussions. We actually we started talking about what is the role of a developer on a Scrum team, what is the role of a QA person on a Scrum team, what's the role of a Tech Pubs person on a Scrum team. One of the interesting things that we came to the conclusion was that Tech Pubs was no different from developers. So anything that a Tech Pubs person had to do, was doing, would also get tested, just like it was a piece of code or anything else. We talked about project planning. Project planning was going to be different on a Scrum team than waterfall. There was also going to be more planning cycles on a Scrum team. We also had a pretty set policy that we would release full release cycles on a regular basis, partial release cycles on a regular basis, and emergency bug fixes. And so we wanted to make sure that we could roll those releases into our Scrum processes. So we had to discuss that. We also talked about some of the development practices that we were going to change. We really wanted to move to a test-driven development methodology, which is is everybody familiar with test-driven development?
Yeah.
Okay. On top of test-driven development, we also wanted to adopt an acceptance or a system-level test-driven development methodology. So one of the things that you'll see later on is that our developers do not start development until all of the system and acceptance level tests are written and established. We also decided that that all teams needed to do continuous integration. At the time, I can't remember whether we had one team that had already built in continuous integration. Jimmy might be able to help me
I can't
out.
remember the timing of it, but yeah, we were doing CI sort of in parallel to a lot of these changes.
Yeah. And so we also talked about responsibilities around testing, the Unity integration, the system level testing. Okay, so those were all topics of discussion. That took many, many months to flesh out and discuss, but we finally came down to a plan. So first thing we did was document this plan, all right? And so what we got was what we call our engineering process document. It starts with some basic concepts around Agile and Scrum and some of the roles within Agile and Scrum. It talks about descriptions of some of the specific processes that we want all the teams to follow. These are fairly high level, but they talk about, they give you guidelines on how to do project planning, how to do what your release cycles need to look like, What sprint planning, what goes into sprint planning, and what goes into test planning, testing roles, and how to fit test-driven development into all of this. Also has a section on final validation and release. The other things that we have added at the as appendices to this document are some of the standard metrics that we gather in order to track the progress of the projects. And all of our processes have been diagrammed out in Visio drawings. So this is kind of our Bible. When somebody says, are you following the process? If they don't know, they're pointed at this document. So, roles and responsibilities. So specifically, we changed up some of the roles and responsibilities on the team. For instance, who owns the process? Everybody owns the process, okay? And everybody from every different group participated in the creation of the engineering process document. When we update our processes, everybody participates in that. QA enforces the process. Okay, so QA needs to understand exactly what all the processes are, and if they see people going off the rails, it's time for them to either raise it to those people or raise it to the proper people to get it fixed. Okay. Who participates in project planning? Once again, everybody. Okay. That's from requirements all the way through sprint planning, all the way through testing, all of that stuff. Who owns requirements? The developers, QA, and tech hubs do. Okay. Who plans the testing? QA obviously plans the testing. However, there's one change. Developers do the system testing. That's probably the biggest change that we have. Our QA people do very little system testing. The majority of the system testing is done by our developers. You may be asking yourself, why this craziness? Well, first of all, one of the things we discovered is that it can't be QA, because QA will have entirely too much to do if they've got to actually do the testing. They've got a whole process that they need to manage, and they need to make sure it's running smoothly. Second of all, developers who test tend to write more testable code. So what we did was, we didn't ask developers to go back and fix anything or change anything in the past. We just asked developers that at some point in time, you're going to start doing the testing. And anything going forward, you're going to test that code on a system test level. And what we've noticed is that the newer stuff, and the stuff they have actually tested is much more maintainable and much easier to fix. Okay? The other thing is that a lot of times we reduce the number of bug reports that we have against the code, at least from the dev team, right? Because if a developer's in there running a test and notices that there's a problem, why open a bug fix? If it only takes a few minutes to fix it, go fix it, run the test, and move on. So it saves that back and forth between QA and dev on that. It also promotes test automation. One of the things that we decided to do was we decided that developers also perform all regression testing. So if you think about early on, we had a bunch of regression suites that were all manual tests, because why not? QA's running it. We don't need to automate it. QA will take care of that. If QA wants to automate it, they'll get around to automating it. It took about 1 or 2 rounds of developers having to run all those manual tests, and they started figuring out ways to automate this stuff and automate the regression. As I had said earlier, we had 2 people who were in charge of automating tests when I started managing QA. Shortly after I started managing QA, those guys moved into the product dev group and started writing code. And so that is by design. Actually, if you look at the QA group today, the ratio of QA person to developer is somewhere around 10 to 1. I'm sorry, developer to QA person, right? So one QA person for about 10 developers. So that is also by design. We wanted the QA department to be lean and mean and be focused on defect prevention, not defect detection. This is a little more about test planning and strategy, or the test responsibilities. When I talk about developers testing and QA not testing, one of the things that QA does need to do is QA actually needs to write the tests. And when I talk about writing the tests, QA writes objectives and scenarios, okay? Developers are responsible for writing design steps and actually running the tests. Does that make sense to everybody, the difference between scenarios and design steps? Or is that a little cloudy for people? Because I know when we started out, it was a little cloudy for the QA people that I had because they were literally just writing design steps. And so one of the things that I needed to train them to do, or we needed to get them trained up on, was how to write a good scenario as opposed to a design step.
Could you briefly give an example of those? Because it sounds to me like what we do is write scenarios.
Sure.
And we have the developers write design steps.
Okay.
I feel like we're doing a bit of both, but we just don't call them that.
Okay, so let's suppose that you want to test, you want to write a test for a login to an application, right? So the objective of the test would be something along the lines of the objective of this test is to validate that the system properly validates my credentials. Okay. The scenario might be, given that you have a person who is a valid user to the system, when they enter in the proper username and password, the system will log them into the system, right? And we'll also go into wrong scenarios where we'll say the same thing when you have a valid user, but the user puts in incorrect credentials, then they will receive an error message telling them that they're not logged in. The design steps for that would be something like go to your web browser, go to this URL, enter in your username in the username field, enter in your password in the password field, and hit the login button. Okay, so those would be the design steps. The scenarios are really more drawing a picture of what a typical user would be doing and looking for. Okay?
Great, thanks. That sounds more like QA function there than business function.
Right.
I mean, I'm ready to make the jump. If you don't need them to test and you just want them to set up the process, then yeah, you could have one QA person that 100 developers with that approach. You're going to end up pushing everything to the developers, which I don't know. I can't see that working as well because there are always consistently other testing events that are not related to the project at hand. You're going to upgrade Oracle. You're going to upgrade, the infrastructure that the developer doesn't care about at all.
Oh, I do.
But now you need a QA person to validate that things are going to be okay. So if you lose that knowledge that you're pushing to the developer from the QA person, you won't be much help to them.
But you're not necessarily losing it because you change the Oracle database version. You've already got this huge list of automated tests that the developers have been working on. All you got to do is run them. The database should be agnostic.
I agree totally. So you are saying then the QA person would test it for them because they
The developer runs the automated test after the thing.
So you're going to pull the developer off of coding the next project and run those tests.
Part of
Instead
this
the
is
QA
part
of their
person.
responsibility.
Executing the test shouldn't take any time. It's just a matter of typing a command to run them. They shouldn't need time to write new tests. It's just running the old ones.
Right. I agree. Shouldn't take any time at all. Stop the developer shift his focus onto testing. It is.
Well, you're talking about stopping the developer from doing something that's more important to something that they should do, and that's probably what you have to change, I think. In that upgrading that version is as an important engineering position or task as is developing some code.
I think we're
And
close
the
to saying, somebody needs to run it to upgrade because that's very important, but it's not a core competency of my business. Upgrading Oracle is not what we do. We don't sell that.
Well, yeah, and
Having a developer write new code for new core competencies, he's going to be totally, I'm just saying, it's a great idea.
Every change in thinking.
Well, but I mean, everybody always wants to eliminate your current department and push it to the person that's causing the work. QA is a support function. If you can eliminate the support function and make it to the person that actually requires a supportee, that's a great idea. But if you totally eliminate that knowledge, then you're just creating a developer that does QA, which also does.
Well, a developer that does quality control, right? So the quality control is spread out across the entire dev group. So QA, and so one of the ways that you spread it out is that you get developers involved in the testing. Yes.
So along those lines, my previous employer, when the company first started out, they called the department Software Quality Assurance and Test.
Right.
And then as the company got larger, they started looking into CMMI certification and whatnot. And they ended up splitting test from QA. So there was a QA department that managed the process. Everybody bought in, everybody followed the process, everybody had input on how to change process. But QA managed the process. The testing department ran, created test plans, wrote scenarios and design steps, executed the tests, and worked on the Scrum teams with the developers hand in hand. And that was how that company ended up.
Right, and that's how a lot of companies do it. Is their QA, they have a QA department and they have a quality control department. We don't have the luxury of having a quality control department. One of the reasons that we don't have a quality control department is that, especially when you talk about test automation, that is a skill that really is a developer skill, right? And so we really don't want, we want to hire developers to do the whole package, okay? Not only do we want our developers to be developing software, developing new features and things, we also want them to understand how to test those features and how to do that. So we're not interested in hiring development talent into the quality assurance group or the non-existent quality control group. So our QA function is, I would say, not necessarily a support function for the development team. They're really in product development to provide the customer view of it and to provide their expertise in how the customer is going to use it and how to test those things and how to write those tests and those types of things. Okay.
It
Yes.
just sounds to me like in this type of environment, you're limiting the quality assurance engineer from being able to wear multiple hats. If somebody were to come into your company as a quality assurance engineer, they would be restricted to only quality assurance, analysis, test planning. They would not have the ability to extend their skills and go into test automation or go into these other areas by executing test plans, by creating those test plans. You actually learn more and you increase those skills, but in this environment, you're kind of stuck.
Well, if you want to get into test automation and
Yeah.
all that, then
It's a great concept that
You move
to
into
have
the test
development
You
do
you
the
just all
automation
developers
stuff.
instead of testers, I guess.
yes, we don't. I guess you would say, in our company we do not have testers. And that was one of the, to be honest with you, that was the big apprehension I had about speaking in front of this group, because I know that at concept which basically says, well, you guys don't exist in my company. So I guess
Well, I do exist.
one of the yeah, you know, one of the mistakes that I made in the beginning was when I started talking about this concept was I said, I understand this isn't for everybody. I've seen one other company that's doing similar things. Yes.
Your company, do you have developers that you from the test group that are specialists in test automation that help
Yes.
to mentor the other teams on how to do testing?
Yes, Jim is also with Enchouse.
Hi there.
He's doing. This is Jim Rush. He's teaching the continuous integration class later on. But you got Dave Delster who.
Yeah, they came out of our test automation. Basically, they were part of QA. They were writing test automation frameworks, simulators, those types of things. And these days he does that, but he also builds full products.